There is a drafting table in my office now, the good kind, oak and brass, the kind you inherit rather than buy, and every morning before anyone else arrives I run my hand along the edge of it where the varnish has worn thin in one particular spot, because that is where his hand used to rest. I don't tell my associates why I insist on arriving before them, why I need those 10 quiet minutes with the table before the office fills with phones and deadlines and other people's urgency. I've never told anyone the full truth of it, not completely, not until now. That is the whole story, really, if you already knew how to read it. But you don't yet, so I'll tell it the way it happened, in order, because the order is the only thing that makes any of it make sense. The line I never crossed, in 9 years of knowing him, was simple enough to say in a single breath. I never once told Julian Ashworth that I loved him, and he never once told me either, and neither of us ever needed to, because we both already knew, and knowing was the whole architecture of it. My name is Aloan Voss. I'm 34 now, though I wasn't when any of this started. I grew up in a river town called Millbrook Crossing, the kind of place where the Voss name meant something specific and small. My father, Gideon Voss, ran the hardware store his own father had built, and my mother, Marisol, kept the books for half the town's small businesses out of a converted sunroom. There was a shape to the life I was supposed to live, and it had already been drawn before I was old enough to hold a pencil myself. I was supposed to marry someone steady from town, work somewhere close, and raise children 2 streets from my parents' porch, the way my older brother Corwin eventually did, without complaint, without ever once wondering if there was another shape available to him. I should start with how it began, because the order matters, and because I think you'll understand everything else better once you know how ordinary the beginning actually was. I left Millbrook Crossing at 22 with an architecture degree and a folder of drawings I was embarrassingly proud of, and I took the only real interview I could get, at a firm called Ashworth & Pell, 3 hours from home, in a city that felt too large for me the first 6 months I lived in it. Julian Ashworth was the senior partner, the Ashworth of the name on the letterhead, 48 years old when I met him, married for over 20 of those years to a woman named Helena who ran a small gallery downtown and who I would come to know, in fragments, the way you know the weather in a country you've only read about. Julian hired me himself, out of a stack of 40 portfolios, because of a single detail in my drawings. I'd sketched a stairwell with the landing turned 4 degrees off true, deliberately, so that natural light would fall differently across it in the afternoon than in the morning. He told me later, years later, that it was the only portfolio out of 40 that had noticed the sun moves. I remember the interview itself more clearly than almost anything from that entire first year, because it was the first time in my life that someone had asked me a question about my own work and then actually waited for the real answer instead of the polished one. He was tall in an unhurried way, the way some men are tall without ever seeming to take up more room than they need to. He wore the same gray cardigan to nearly every meeting I ever had with him, over 9 years, and I never once saw him rush through a hallway, even when the office was on fire, quite literally, in year 4, when a wiring fault in the copy room sent 2 floors into evacuation and Julian walked out at the same unhurried pace he walked everywhere, carrying nothing but the drawing he'd been marking up, because he said panic ruins good line work and good line work outlasts most fires anyway. I moved into a studio apartment above a bicycle repair shop that first year, 4 blocks from the office, because it was the only thing I could afford on an associate's salary after culinary, after architecture school had left me with more debt than I liked to think about late at night. My parents called that first autumn, proud in the distant, slightly bewildered way people are proud of a life they don't fully recognize as one worth choosing. My mother asked if I'd met anyone. I told her I'd met my boss, which was true, and which felt, at the time, like the least interesting fact I could have offered her. I should tell you plainly, here at the start, what the gap between us was, because this format only works if I don't hide the axis of it from you the way I hid it from myself for longer than I'd like to admit. Julian was my superior. He was 26 years older than me. He was married, and not unhappily. Not in the way people tell themselves to make room for something else. Helena Ashworth was, by every account I ever gathered, a good and thoughtful woman, and Julian spoke of her with a steadiness that never once cracked, not in 9 years, not even at the end. That was the forbidden axis, named plainly, the way the format demands, a young associate and her married mentor, 26 years and one wedding ring standing permanently between whatever it was we were building. The specific ritual of it began small. Every Thursday, Julian reviewed junior associates' drawings over lunch, a rotating cast of us bringing our work to his office at noon with sandwiches from the same deli. But within a year it had narrowed, without either of us arranging it, to just me. My Thursdays became a standing hour, drawings spread across his desk, him tracing a finger along a line I'd drawn and saying, almost to himself, "Tell me why you did this," and waiting, actually waiting, for an answer that mattered to him. There were 3 small things from those early years that I still carry, 3 objects and habits that will matter again before this story is finished, so I want to name them now, the way you'd point out landmarks before a long drive. The first was a fountain pen, a plain black one he always used to mark up drawings, never a red pen like the other partners, because he said red ink made people defensive and black ink made them curious. The second was a habit he had of leaving his office door open exactly halfway, never fully open, never closed, a specific and deliberate half measure that I didn't understand the significance of until much later. And the third was a phrase, 4 words he said to me more times over 9 years than I could count: good. Now go further. Not well done. Not I'm proud of you. Just an instruction to keep moving, which somehow meant more to me than praise ever could have. There was a woman at the firm named Priscilla Danvers, a structural engineer 2 offices down from mine, who noticed things before I was ready for anyone to notice them. In my second year, she stopped by my desk on a Friday evening and watched me repin a drawing for the 3rd time that I had already shown Julian twice that week. "You know everyone sees it, don't you?" she said, without much preamble. "The way you 2 work." I asked her what she meant, and she just looked at me the way you look at someone who has asked a question they already know the answer to. "Nothing's happened," I told her, which was true. "I didn't ask if anything happened," she said. "I asked if you knew people saw it." I didn't have an answer for her that Friday, and she never brought it up directly again, though I caught her watching, sometimes, in the years after, with an expression I could never fully name, not disapproval, exactly. Something closer to worry. I should say honestly, because this story only works if I'm honest in the telling of it, that I didn't fully understand what I felt for Julian Ashworth for the first 2 years I knew him. I told myself it was admiration, then mentorship, then something closer to the specific gratitude you feel towards someone who sees a version of you that you haven't fully grown into yet. It was only in the 3rd year, in a small and undramatic moment, that I understood it was something else entirely. We were working late on a competition entry, just the 2 of us, past 10 at night, and he reached across the desk to adjust a drawing I'd pinned slightly crooked, and his hand brushed mine, and neither of us moved for perhaps 4 seconds. I counted them afterward, lying awake, the way you count something you're trying to convince yourself didn't mean what you know it meant. He said, quietly, "Sorry," and straightened the drawing, and neither of us spoke about it again. But something had shifted, and we both knew it had shifted, and from that night forward there was a second conversation running underneath every ordinary one we had, a conversation made entirely of things neither of us said. My family, back in Millbrook Crossing, heard about him before I ever told them anything true. A colleague of mine, at a wedding 2 summers later, mentioned to someone who mentioned it to my mother that I spent an awful lot of hours with my married boss, said with the particular insinuations small towns specialize in, whether or not there's any truth beneath it. My mother called me that week, and I remember the exact words she used, because they were the words that started the ending of my life in that town. "People are saying things, Aloan, about you and a married man. I need you to tell me it isn't true." I told her, that first time, that it was ridiculous, that Julian was simply my mentor, that the hours meant nothing more than the ordinary hours any dedicated associate put in at a demanding firm. I believed that, mostly, when I said it, or believed it enough to say it without my voice catching. My mother didn't push further that first call, though I could hear, underneath her silence, the particular quality of a person filing something away rather than letting it go. She asked when I might come home for a visit. I told her soon, and didn't mean it, the way you don't mean most promises you make to keep a conversation from going somewhere you're not ready for it to go. It was 6 months later, at my cousin's engagement party, that my mother brought it up again, this time with more information than I'd given her, a photograph, apparently, that someone had taken at a firm gala and posted somewhere online, of Julian and me standing slightly too close together at the edge of a group photo, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. "You're standing like a couple, alone," she said, holding her phone toward me the way you'd hold evidence. "I'm not asking you to explain a photograph. I'm asking you to tell me honestly what this is." I told her, honestly, that it was nothing, and I believed that too, or believed it the way you believe the last sentence you say before a longer silence begins. I told her, honestly, that nothing had happened. That was true, and it stayed true for the entire 9 years, and I need you to hold on to that fact, because everything I'm about to tell you depends on you believing it. Nothing happened. Not once. Not the way that phrase usually means. But my mother didn't hear the truth as reassurance. She heard it as a technicality. "Nothing happening yet," she said, "isn't the same as nothing happening at all. You've built your whole life around this man, alone. Around waiting for him. That's not a life. That's a haunting." I want to sit with that word for a moment, because she wasn't entirely wrong, even if the way she said it wounded me more than almost anything else in this story. I had, without ever naming it to myself, built a shape around Julian Ashworth's presence, the way a plant grows around a trellis it never asked permission to use. My parents saw that shape from the outside, without any of the nuance I lived inside, and they made a decision about it that felt, to them, like the only responsible thing left to do. The dinner where it ended came 8 months later, at Christmas, the last Christmas I ever spent under that roof. The house was decorated the same way it had been every year of my childhood, the same wreath on the same nail on the door, and for the first hour of that visit I let myself believe the year hadn't changed anything at all. It was over the roast, with my brother Corwin quiet at the far end of the table and his wife making careful small talk about the weather, that my father set down his fork in a way that told me he'd been waiting all evening for the right moment to say something he'd rehearsed. "You've chosen a life we can't recognize, alone," my father, Gideon, said, plainly, the way he said everything, without embellishment. "A married man's shadow instead of a life of your own. We didn't raise you to disappear into someone else's marriage." I told him nothing had happened, again, and he said the same thing my mother had said, in different words, months earlier, over that same photograph. That's the saddest part of all this. 9 years from now, you'll still be able to say nothing happened, and you'll have given away your whole youth for it. He said 9 years, specifically, though I didn't understand until much later how strange it would feel to have that exact number come back to me, unbidden, at the precise moment it finally meant something different. My mother didn't defend me, though she didn't fully agree with him either. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, the particular posture of a woman who has decided that staying quiet is its own kind of allegiance. It was Corwin, finally, who spoke, not in my defense, but not entirely against me either. "Maybe it's not our business, what she's building down there," he said, quietly, and my father turned on him with a sharpness I hadn't seen directed at my brother before. "It becomes our business the moment the whole town is talking about it instead of us," he said, and that ended whatever small opening Corwin had tried to create. My brother Corwin didn't defend me, though he didn't attack me either. He simply sat there, the way people do when they've decided a fight isn't theirs to have. I left that house before dessert, and I didn't come back for 4 years, and when I did come back, it was for my father's funeral, and by then everything between my parents and me had gone quiet in a way that felt less like anger and more like a door someone had simply stopped opening. I threw myself into the work after that. Threw myself into Julian's mentorship in a way that might have looked, from the outside, exactly like what my mother had feared, a woman disappearing into a man's shadow instead of building a life of her own. But that isn't what it was, and I think Julian understood that better than my family ever could, because he never once let me disappear. He pushed me toward my own commissions, my own name on drawings, my own byline in journals. "Good. Now go further," he told me, again and again, and I came to understand, slowly, that those 4 words were his way of refusing to let me collapse the space between us into something smaller and more convenient than what it actually was. There was a specific year, my 6th at the firm, when a developer offered me a commission entirely on my own name, no Ashworth attached to the letterhead, for a boutique hotel renovation on the coast. I remember bringing the offer to Julian's office, half expecting him to find a reason to keep me close, the way lesser mentors sometimes do when a protégé threatens to outgrow the room they were trained in. He read the offer twice, in silence, and then slid it back across the desk toward me. "Take it," he said. "And don't come back here asking my opinion on a single line of it. If you need permission to do this, well, you haven't been listening to me for 6 years." I took the commission. I didn't ask his opinion on a single line of it, though I sent him a photograph of the finished lobby anyway, unprompted, and he wrote back 4 words on a postcard that I still have somewhere in that same drawer: "Good. Now go further," as if he'd been waiting the whole time for exactly that photograph to arrive. It was around that same period that I started noticing how carefully Julian managed the visible shape of what we were, in a way that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with protecting both Helena and me from a version of the story neither of us deserved to be caught inside. He stopped scheduling our Thursdays at a fixed hour, staggering them instead so no pattern would be obvious to anyone tracking his calendar. He began CCing a second associate on emails that used to come to me alone, not because he trusted me less, but because he understood, better than I did at the time, how quickly a private devotion curdles into something ugly the moment it becomes visible to people who weren't given permission to interpret it. I resented that carefulness, quietly, for longer than I'd like to admit, before I came to understand it as its own form of protection, of me, as much as of himself. There was a moment, in year 5, when the tension between us was tested directly, the only time it ever was. We were in Lisbon for a conference, both of us, and after a dinner that ran long with wine neither of us had planned to drink so much of, we ended up walking back to the hotel along a street above the river, and he stopped walking, and so did I, and for a moment that felt like it lasted the entire length of that street, we simply stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him against the cold coming off the water, and neither of us said anything, and neither of us moved closer. And after that unbearable, suspended length of time, he said, quietly, "Helena would forgive a great many things. I don't think she'd forgive this one. And I don't think I'd forgive myself either." And then he stepped back, and the distance between us returned to its ordinary size, and we walked the rest of the way to the hotel talking about a roofline detail from that afternoon's site visit, as if nothing at all had almost happened. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in an unfamiliar hotel room turning his sentence over in the dark, the way you turn over a stone looking for the underside of it. He hadn't said he didn't want to. He'd said Helena wouldn't forgive it, and he wouldn't forgive himself, which was a very different sentence than the one I'd half expected, and it took me years to understand that the difference mattered more than almost anything else he ever said to me. He wasn't telling me the wanting wasn't there. He was telling me the wanting wasn't going to be allowed to matter more than the promise he'd made to someone else, 20 years before he'd ever met me. There was something in that distinction I came, eventually, to respect more than I would have respected the alternative, a man who crossed a line and called it love, instead of a man who held one and called it discipline. The following morning, at breakfast, he handed me his black fountain pen without a word, because I'd forgotten mine at the hotel in the city and needed to mark up a set of drawings before the panel review that afternoon. It was such a small, ordinary gesture that I don't think either of us registered, in the moment, how much it was doing the work that words couldn't. I used that pen all morning. He never asked for it back until we were packing to leave, and even then, he only held his hand out, palm up, and waited, the way he waited for everything, patiently, without pressure, entirely willing to let me decide when the moment was over. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because the honesty is the entire point of telling you this now. I wasn't relieved, and I wasn't only disappointed. I felt something closer to a strange, aching respect, for a boundary he could have crossed and chose, deliberately, not to. That restraint became, over the following years, its own kind of intimacy, stranger, and in some ways deeper than anything a crossed line could have given us. The relationship changed shape in year 7, when Julian's health began to decline in small, private ways he didn't discuss with the office, though I noticed a tremor in his left hand that made his black ink corrections shakier, a fatigue that shortened our Thursday hours from 60 minutes to 40, then to 20. He retired at the end of that year, earlier than anyone expected, and Helena took him to a smaller house outside the city, closer to their daughter, and our contact narrowed to occasional letters, because Julian preferred letters to phone calls. Said a phone call disappeared the moment it ended, but a letter stayed in a drawer. His letters, when they came, were never long, and never once said anything that could be misread by anyone who might have opened them by accident, a habit I understood, without either of us ever discussing it, as its own kind of care. He wrote about a fig tree he was trying to keep alive in the new garden. He wrote about a competition he'd red-eyed won, always phrased as, "I imagine you'll have won that Riverside Commission by the time this reaches you," never a direct congratulations, as if congratulations might tip the careful balance we'd spent 7 years maintaining. I kept every one of those letters in the same drawer where I eventually kept his fountain pen, though it would be 2 more years before that drawer held both. I told myself, during that period, that our story had simply ended the way undramatic stories end, not with a rupture, but with distance, the ordinary erosion of a friendship, if that's even the right word for what we were, once its daily structure disappears. I built my own firm during those 2 years, hired 3 associates of my own, and caught myself, more than once, leaving my office door open exactly halfway before I fully understood where I'd learned to do that. I told myself I had moved on, in the specific way people tell themselves things that are only half true, and Priscilla Danvers, who I still had lunch with twice a year, once asked me, gently, whether I'd heard from him lately, and I said, "A letter last month. About a fig tree," and she looked at me the way she used to look at me at my old desk, and said nothing else. Julian died in the spring of my 9th year at the firm, quietly, in his sleep, the kind of death people call peaceful because it spares everyone the specifics. I learned about it from a call from his daughter, whose voice I recognized without ever having properly met her, because she sounded exactly like him when he was choosing his words carefully. I stood at the back of the funeral, deliberately, the way you stand when you've never had to publicly explain what someone was to you and don't intend to start on the day of his burial. Helena stood at the front, composed in the specific way I imagined she'd had 20 years of marriage to a careful man to practice for exactly this kind of day. I didn't approach her afterward. I shook hands with colleagues I hadn't seen in 2 years, accepted condolences from people who assumed I was grieving a mentor and nothing more, and I let them assume it, because there was no version of the truth I could have offered that wouldn't have asked something unfair of Helena on the worst day of her life. It was only as the crowd was thinning, near the cars, that she found me herself, took my hand in both of hers for a moment longer than a simple condolence required, and said, quietly, "Come see me in a few weeks. There's something he wanted you to have, and I think it needs to be given properly, not handed off in a parking lot." I didn't understand, then, what she meant. I understand it completely now. The discovery came 3 weeks after the funeral, in a small conference room at his family's lawyer's office, where Helena Ashworth herself asked me to come, specifically, alone. I want to render this the way it actually happened, because it's the center of everything. Helena was smaller than I expected, in the particular way grief makes people smaller, and she looked at me for a long moment before she spoke, the way you look at someone you've decided, finally, to stop being afraid of. "I know who you were to him," she said. "I knew for years. I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this out of anger. I'm telling you because he asked me to, if I outlived him, and because I think you've spent a long time not knowing something you deserve to know." She slid a folder across the table. Inside it were 9 years of financial records, a scholarship fund, established anonymously the year I was hired, that had quietly paid down the entirety of my architecture school debt over 4 years, routed through a foundation with a name that meant nothing to me until Helena explained it was an anagram of my own name, chosen, she said, so that if you ever looked closely enough to notice, some part of you would still have to guess. "He never told you," Helena said, "because he didn't want it to feel like a transaction. He didn't do it so you'd owe him anything. He did it because he watched you work harder than anyone in that office to build a life you weren't handed, and he couldn't stand the thought of a debt slowing you down when talent like yours came along so rarely. I sat with that folder in my lap for a long time before I could speak. 9 years of quiet devotion, never once mentioned, never once used as leverage or explanation for anything between us. The fountain pen, the half-open door, the 4 words he repeated like a private liturgy, good. Now go further, all of it recalibrated, instantly, into something both larger and more painful than I had understood it to be. He hadn't just mentored me. He had built an entire invisible foundation beneath my life and asked nothing in return, not even acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would have made it about him instead of about what he wanted for me. Did he love me? I asked Helena, because I needed to ask someone, and there was no one else left who could possibly answer. She considered the question with a kindness I hadn't expected and didn't feel I deserved. I think he loved you the way you love something you know isn't yours to keep, she said. Carefully. Completely. And without ever once reaching for more than what was already, technically, allowed. She paused. I made my peace with it a long time ago. He never crossed a line with you. I want you to know that, because I know it, and because I think some part of you needs to hear it from someone other than yourself. I asked her how long she'd known, and she told me she'd suspected within the first year, and known for certain by the third, the year of the fountain pen and the half-open door, though she never said how she'd come to know it, only that a wife develops an instinct for the shape of her husband's attention, the way you develop an instinct for a drawing that's slightly off true. She said she'd considered, more than once, asking him to move me to another team, another office, another city even, and that she hadn't, in the end, because she'd watched what our Thursdays did to his posture, his patience, the particular steadiness he carried into every room afterward, and she'd decided that whatever it was costing her, it was keeping something alive in him that she still loved too much to extinguish. That's its own kind of restraint, she told me. Mine looked different than yours. But it was restraint all the same. I hadn't expected, walking into that office, to leave it with more respect for Helena Ashworth than I'd ever managed to hold for her from a distance, and yet that is exactly what happened. She told me, too, about the fig tree, that it had died within a year, that Julian had planted 3 more after it in the same spot, each one failing a little differently, and that he'd kept trying anyway, long after any reasonable gardener would have given up on that patch of soil. He was like that about most things he cared for, she said. He didn't need them to thrive under his hand to keep tending them. The tending was the point. I understood, sitting across from her, that she was no longer only talking about a fig tree. I left that office and drove for almost an hour before I could pull over, and when I did, I sat in the car and let myself finally understand 9 years all at once, not just what Julian had done for me, but what I had let myself become, quietly, in his orbit. Devoted. Careful. Restrained in the exact shape he had been restrained, as if restraint itself were something we had built together, brick by brick, instead of a wall keeping us apart. In the 11 months between the conference room and that visit, my firm had grown in a way I still find strange to describe out loud without feeling like I'm bragging about someone else's life. What had been 3 associates became 11. The Riverside Library restoration, a project I'd taken on partly because it reminded me of the stairwell drawing that first got me hired, won a regional preservation award that spring, and the magazine feature that followed it ran alongside a photograph of me standing in the library's reading room, one hand resting, without my noticing until I saw the print later, on the corner of a drafting table not unlike the one Helena would send me months afterward. I hadn't set out to build any of it as a monument to Julian's 4 words, good. Now go further, but I understood, looking at that photograph, that I had built it that way anyway, brick by brick, the same as I'd once built the devotion my mother had mistaken for a haunting. I went back to Millbrook Crossing 11 months after the conference room, for reasons that had very little to do with Julian directly and everything to do with a phone call from my mother, the second phone call that mattered in this story, though this one arrived very differently than the first. She had read that small profile in the regional design magazine, the 2-page feature on my restoration of an old riverside library, the kind of piece that quietly proves you built something real. She called and said, simply, "I didn't know you'd become this." The drive back into town felt different than it had 9 years earlier, the same river road, the same water tower with the town's name fading on its side, but I noticed things I'd never noticed leaving as a younger woman. How small the hardware store looked now that my father no longer stood behind its counter, how the house itself seemed to have shrunk the way childhood houses do, not because the house changed but because you did. My mother met me at the door before I'd even reached it, and for a moment neither of us said anything, the two of us simply standing in a doorway that had once been the last place I stood before 4 years of silence began. I drove the 3 hours home the following week. My mother had aged in ways that surprised me, the particular aging of someone who has spent years replaying a decision she can't undo. My father was 2 years gone by then, and there was a version of this reunion I might have had with him too, if time had allowed it, though I've made a kind of peace with the fact that it didn't. We sat at the same table where, 9 years earlier, my father had told me I'd given away my youth to a married man's shadow. My mother asked, carefully, the way people ask questions they're afraid of the answer to, "Did anything ever happen with him?" "No," I told her, and this time I said it without needing her to believe me, because I finally, fully believed it myself. Nothing happened. Not once, in 9 years. That was never the point of it. Then what was the point, she asked, and I could hear, underneath the question, all the years of not understanding, all the gossip she'd absorbed from a town that never once asked me directly what was true. I told her about the folder. About the anagrammed foundation. About a man who spent 9 years building an invisible floor beneath my life and never once asked me to notice it. I told her about a fountain pen handed across a breakfast table in Lisbon, and a sentence about forgiveness that meant more, in the end, than any confession would have. I told her that restraint isn't the same as absence, that some of the deepest devotion I have ever witnessed or received came wrapped entirely in things that were never said, never done, never crossed. You called it a haunting, I told her. But a haunting takes something from you. This gave me almost everything I have. My mother sat with that for a long time, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer, and then she said something I hadn't expected. Your father used to say the same thing about the hardware store. That he never once told his own father he was grateful for it, and by the time he thought to, it was too late to say it and mean it the way he wanted to. She looked at me then, really looked, the way I remembered her looking at me when I was small enough to still believe every word she said was the whole truth. I don't know if I would have understood any of this 9 years ago. I'm not certain I understand it completely now. But I believe you. And I'm sorry it took me this long to ask instead of assume. I told her, too, about Priscilla Danvers, who still asks after me twice a year, and who once said the truest thing anyone said to me in the whole of it, that nothing having happened was never proof that nothing mattered. My mother nodded slowly at that, as if it settled something in her that gossip never could have. What I needed, and what I finally got, sitting at that table 9 years and 11 months after the dinner that ended things, was simply to be believed, to have the truth, finally, land somewhere other than my own memory. I don't know, even now, exactly what Julian Ashworth felt for me across those 9 years, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing entirely. I know what Helena told me. I know what a folder of financial records suggested. I know what 4 seconds on a bridge in Lisbon felt like, and what 4 words repeated across nearly a decade came to mean. But I don't know if he ever, in the privacy of his own mind, let himself finish the sentence the rest of us have been too careful to finish here either. Some part of me thinks that not knowing, completely, permanently, is the last and most honest gift he left me, because it means the story stays exactly the shape he built it to be. Restrained. Complete. Never once crossed. The drafting table sits in my office now, the one with the worn spot in the varnish, because Helena sent it to me 8 months after that conference room, with a note that said only, he would have wanted you to have somewhere to rest your hand. I keep his fountain pen in the top drawer, though I've never once used it, because I think some instruments are meant to be kept rather than used, the way some things between two people are meant to be understood rather than said. I keep his letters in that same drawer, still bound with the same rubber band Helena used when she gave me the box of them, still in the order he wrote them, the fig tree failing and being replanted 3 separate times across 9 pages of small, careful handwriting. Priscilla Danvers came to see the new office last spring, walked the length of the drafting room the way she used to walk the length of my old desk, and stopped at the table without my having told her anything about where it came from. "This is his, isn't it?" she said, not really a question, and I told her it was, and she nodded slowly, the way she'd nodded at me all those years ago on a Friday evening I still think about more than I probably should. "I always wondered how it would end," she said. "I don't think I ever imagined it ending like this. Quietly. Without either of you ever having to be sorry for anything." I think that's exactly right, and I think it took me longer than it should have to understand that an ending without anything to apologize for is its own rare kind of gift. My mother and I speak most weeks now, carefully, the way two people speak when they're both still learning a new shape for an old relationship. She's never met Helena, though she asked, once, if she might like to, and I told her I didn't know, and that some bridges are better left as the single, private crossing they were always meant to be. She didn't push. I think, of everything that changed in her over these last 2 years, that not pushing might be the change I'm most grateful for. I think, in the end, that's the truest thing I know about restraint, about love, about the particular ache of a life built around a boundary that never moved. Some of the deepest devotion anyone will ever give you doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask to be returned. It simply builds a floor beneath your feet, quietly, for years, and waits to see if you'll notice it before it's gone. I didn't notice mine in time to thank him for it properly. But I notice it every single morning now, in the worn place on an old oak table, in a fountain pen I'll never use, in letters about a fig tree that never once managed to survive, and I think that has to be enough, because in the end, it was always going to have to be. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.